moderating this panel on the Killer Angels. The question being, is the Killer Angels necessary for an understanding of Gettysburg? I will begin by introducing the other two panelists, and then I will sit down and join them. To my immediate right here is Matt Atkinson, who hails from Houston, Mississippi. As he points out, Grierson's raid came through this town, so there is a point of Civil War fame in his very birth. He works at the Gettysburg National Military Park. Attended Ole Miss. He is currently pursuing a Master of Arts in History at the University of Louisiana Monroe, and his thesis is on the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, or as he calls it, Dead Yankees in a Swamp. And I know where you're from by whether or not you're laughing at that. He currently resides in Gettysburg with his wife Angela and 5-year-old son Benjamin Lee. James Trulock, to my far right, did all the research for In the Hands of Providence, which some of you have noted undoubtedly is available back there, that wonderful biography of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. It was the Killer Angels which sparked his original interest in Colonel Chamberlain. He's been studying him for over 30 years. And I should point out, he let me know that he borrowed a copy of the Killer Angels in 1977 and has not returned it yet. I say that not to really make much of a point on the study of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, but to warn you, if he asks to borrow a pen, or maybe your watch. And as I mentioned, my name is Kent Graham. I teach here at Gettysburg College. I've written some books on the Battle of Gettysburg, the Civil War, Lincoln, and the Gettysburg Address. I also worked as a volunteer. I want to put in a little plug for the Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation. Some of you might not be aware that the old dorm, which was is on the first day's battle, has been renovated and made into a museum. A multi-million-dollar project has been completed. The grand opening, I think, is on the 1st of July. And I invite you to go and have a look sometime when you're in Gettysburg. The museum is on the use of that building as a hospital and as the principal building of the theological seminary that was there at the time and still is there, and various other subjects, including the subject of religion and war, which has become the subject of our annual symposium. I direct the annual Seminary Ridge Symposium, and from now on, we will have a short conference. It's only a day-and-a-half conference on the subject of religion and war. Usually we're going to be centering on the Civil War, as we've done for the past 10 years, but not every year. I want to point out that at one of those symposia, we actually had a member of Parliament who was interested in the Civil War. He flew over to attend that, but the Civil War Institute has outdone the foundation by a mile this year, in that I want to mention that there's an actual member of royalty present at the Civil War Institute. I'm referring to myself. A few days ago I had a crown installed. It's sick, I know, but I have to pay a lot for this session. I've actually had 3, and if I lapse into the royal we, you'll understand why. But before I continue with more frivolity, let's look at the Killer Angels, consider whether it actually is necessary for an understanding of the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm going to ask my 2 fellow panelists, one at a time, to make an opening statement, and then I will ask further questions, and we'll go from there. So as I go over and sit down, let's start with Matt. And he warned me we're going to be loose here, so let's let it go.
That's how it goes, right? I always wondered, first of all, I'd just like to say, I always wondered what the view was from up here. This is my first panel. You know, you should come up here and try it sometime. You know, it's beyond the pale. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Civil War Institute and the directors, the staff, and everybody for inviting me to the panel today. I am, as an interpreter at Gettysburg National Military Park, half of my job is reading people, audiences, and so forth. And so over the years, I've watched the bigwigs, the PhDs sit up here, and I've often wondered, you know, how I was supposed to act when my bio was being read, for instance. You know, are you supposed to act nonchalant? Am I supposed to talk to my neighbor here, or am I really supposed to, like, just be real, like I'm really feeling right now, which is like, I just made it to the big table with the grown-ups. I would like to say that I am a fan, just like you are, of the American Civil War. And I've even got my books right here, all paginated for the authors if I happen to see them. Dr. Graham is one of those, and I was going to hit him up, so don't you be asking too many questions. I got to get his autograph. Speaking of being a Civil War fan and the Killer Angels, being born in 1971, I became interested in military history when I was 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old. And I know I'm dating myself, but we used to get toys from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And my parents ordered a little Fort Ticonderoga. You New Yorkers will be very happy about that. And it came with a little booklet on the Revolutionary War, and that kind of took off. And I was lucky enough to have parents to take me to various battlefields. I did not have the Killer Angels at my disposal, but if it was, I'm sure I would have read it as soon as I got into it. I read John B. Gordon's Reminiscences in the 5th grade. You know, and my mother used to get, I'm smart or anything, I just like to read. My mother used to get notes that Matt is rushing through his schoolwork in order to read Civil War books. You know, so I am truly lucky to make a living. But fast forwarding on my timeline, I became a quote-unquote reenactor, which I know is an anathema to a lot of people. But what do you do in Northeast Mississippi? You become a Johnny Reb. And my first reenactment was here at the Battle of the reenactment of Gettysburg for the 135th. Okay, you were there? All right. Now the movie Gettysburg came out in 93, 92, 91, somewhere in there. 93, is that the general consensus? Let me show you how, to start off on the Killer Angels, and I can't believe I'm admitting this to you, all right, but to show you what influence the Killer Angels had on me. When I got to Gettysburg, it was my second visit to the Battle of Gettysburg. My first was in like 1987 or 88. And my second visit, we went to the monument of the 20th Maine. And guess whose name I looked for? Buster. That's right. And I could not figure out why he was not on the monument. Right. But that goes into the topic, historical fiction versus history. I mean, and that is the difficult thing. The question is the Killer Angels, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Killer Angels necessary to understanding the Battle of Gettysburg? Now, picture yourself in my shoes. I will answer this on two fronts, personally and professionally here today. Personally, since that time, I do not think so, that the Killer Angels is necessary. In my line of work professionally, though, I would say yes, because we are constantly, I wouldn't say fighting, probably not the wrong word, but rolling back, if you will, visitors' perceptions of the battle based upon this novel. And for those people, it's a double-edged sword. First of all, you would love to have, what part would not want to have a book and a movie written about it? Not to mention a Pulitzer out here. The problem with that is, though, people believe that that is the reality of the battle. I'm sure we'll get into those questions in just a minute. So, for instance, on Little Round Top, Joshua Chamberlain, I'll give you a great example. Before the movie Gettysburg came out, when you walk back to the 20th Main Monument, it looked like the rest of the forest. It did. Old guides will tell you that. Older licensed guides will tell you that. Today, it's just been completely tramped over. So professionally, I must know what is within the Killer Angels in order to understand the visitor's perspective. Personally, going back to that, I would never make a good PhD because I can't remember titles. I can only remember that I read something somewhere. Are you like that? You know? And I'm afraid that the Killer Angels going into the Rolodex will get mixed up with the other stuff. Where did I read that?
Thank you. Well, let's move on.
It's wonderful to be among you, first of all, let me say. You're so knowledgeable, and I'm glad to be here, very much so. My answer to the question posed to us is very like the old joke where one guy asked the other guy, "Do you have trouble making up your mind?" And the other guy said, "Well, yes and no." I've kind of in that boat. And my answer is yes and no. I borrowed this very book in 1977. I haven't given it back yet. But I have to say, in my defense, I did buy her a better copy. And I did keep this one. It was kind of shoved in my face and said, you're a Civil War buff, you read this. And I said, well, you know, I'm not all that into historical fiction. She says, no, read this. I did, and I have to say, it changed my life. Had I not read this, I would have not begun to pursue my interest in the life of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Alice Trulock would have not joined me in that pursuit. There would be no In the Hands of Providence without this book. Having said that, my interest in Civil War dates back to my childhood, and Pete talked about it briefly yesterday. My mother made me, and I mean made me, I sure didn't want to do it, go down to the center of town in Indianapolis, which is called Monument Circle. There's a great Civil War monument there. And look at these old guys that you could barely see. They rode them in the back of a convertible and rolled them around the circle, and they were so tiny by then you could barely see them, and they marched in to the old English hotel, and I got to see 4 Civil War veterans. I have to say that really did change my life. It became somehow at that point a personal experience, and I wanted to learn more. The same thing was true of the Killer Angels. As a Civil War buff, and we may be the only panel here, Kent, where PhDs are in the minority. But I'm not either. Okay. I was so interested in Joshua Chamberlain and some of the other characters in the book too. But particularly Joshua Chamberlain, and to tell you the truth, I knew about him from 2 experiences. I knew through reading some of the popular histories, mainly Bruce Catton's histories, that he was a defender of Little Round Top, and that he received the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia and Appomattox. Those were essentially the 2 things I knew about him. And I thought that Shaara had overdrawn this character. Heck, nobody's that good. Nobody's that. So I went down to our local library and I got out The Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. We had actually had a copy of Powell's 5th Corps, had a copy of The Passing of the Army, several other things related to Chamberlain. And I found out that Shaara didn't tell half of it. This guy was his own version of Superman. He was, in my view, still is the model of citizen soldiers. He was an intellectual who, at an intellectual level, understood what he was doing there. He gave meaning to the struggle that I think is better articulated than anybody I know, really, with the possible exception of Abe Lincoln in his speech over here. It literally changed my life in that regard, and that's what the reading of historical fiction sometimes can do for you. It illuminates characters in such a way that straight history is not able to do. It recreates conversations. It comes to conclusions that an historian rightfully can't do. Right or wrong, they don't have to be right. And brings these characters to life so that you want to learn more. Now, I don't want to generalize on that. That's my own experience, but I think that can be the experience for a lot of people. Not just about the Killer Angels, but about historical fiction in general. It can flip that switch for us that puts us on that path to learning more about our heritage. And that's a good idea for everybody.
Thank you both. Well, as the resident pointy-headed intellectual, I guess it's up to me to raise the question of defining terms. Let me say that when I first heard this question was proposed that I moderate this panel on the question of is the Killer Angels necessary to understand the Battle of Gettysburg, I thought, no, of course not. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. You know, why would you need a novel? How's that going to help you understand the Battle of Gettysburg? But because I have a certain streak of perversity in me, I thought, what if I took the opposite point of view and answered the question yes? And then I realized that the answer is yes. I think. I'm about to tell you why. At least I'll give you a few reasons why. And I found that far from being the dumbest thing I ever heard, it's a very good question. And I think it gets at a lot of where we are with this battle. Okay, imagine this. You're going over to the telegraph office. You're the President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln goes over to the telegraph office and he gets bits of information about what's happening up here in south central Pennsylvania. Bit by bit, this thing comes in. And then at the end of it, he concludes something. He concludes that General Meade, as he says in the memorable biblical cadences, we had the enemy within our grasp and we let them escape. In other words, his understanding of the battle is that Lee's army was finishable in a sense. Now, a recent book on the Battle of Gettysburg, which some of you probably already read, more or less agrees with that interpretation. Another classic on the Battle of Gettysburg, which almost all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, Coddington's Gettysburg Campaign, disagrees. And so do many other writers, that Lincoln was incorrect about what happened here and the results and what Meade should do. In other words, Lincoln's understanding of the battle was either correct, according to some people, or was incorrect, according to others. So what is it? What is that understanding that we're talking about? What does it mean to understand something? I'm going to read you a passage from Coddington. The book is too big and heavy for James to carry, so I brought just one page. Although the real meaning of Meade's victory at Gettysburg emerged only with the passage of time. Its immediate effect was to give the Army of the Potomac a sense of triumph and so on. But that's the part that I wanted. The real meaning of Meade's victory at Gettysburg emerged in the passage of time. The real meaning, that's what understanding is. So what is the real meaning, and how do we put together these little fragments of information? And then how do we interpret somebody's understanding of putting those fragments together? Who's right, Meade or Lincoln? Who understands the battle better, Meade or Lincoln? According to what criteria? In other words, what does it mean to understand the battle? So the first thing I'd say, it's a long professorial way to get at the first point, is nobody understands the battle. Nobody really gets all the information, knows how to put it all together. Nobody knows what it means in the long run, 50 years from now. Nobody really fully, completely understands the battle. Therefore, we need everything we can get, including a piece of fiction that brings certain meanings to light. That's one sense in which I think we do need this book. Well, you can ask some questions then, some further things. Let me make a couple other points. I don't want to be lecturing. I want to turn it back to my fellows, but to make a couple of points for you to argue with, nothing else. To understand can mean to make sense of. So how do we make sense of this battle? Clearly, understanding means more than having all the facts. I just stated that none of us can understand the battle in that way. None of us can have all the facts. Our heads aren't big enough to hold them. We don't know what they all were. The believers in, like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, in a providence, in a God, can perhaps say that only God can know all the facts and can really understand this battle. So we're dealing with limited understandings. But how do we make sense of it? Well, here's one way to make sense of it.
Can I borrow it?
How can you say no to a person who wants to read a book? Okay, so Kilrain, who we know is fictional, is talking to Chamberlain, who is comparable to Superman. The two are talking on page 178 of this book in the paperback version of it. And Kilrain, I wish I could duplicate his accent. He says, "What matters is justice. 'Tis why I'm here. I'll be treated as I deserve, not as my father deserved. I'm Kilrain, and I goddamn all gentlemen." That is what the Battle of Gettysburg means to Kilrain. And maybe that's what the Battle of Gettysburg meant to Abraham Lincoln. It certainly didn't mean that to other people, but that's a way of making sense of the battle. Battle of Gettysburg has something to do with equality, has something to do with justice. That's one way of understanding the battle. And you don't understand that. You don't make sense of the battle in that way by reading a tactical study. You need something like this. You need somebody making sense of the facts. How do we make sense of the facts? And that is another way of meaning the word understanding. So yes, you need interpretation in order to understand this imperfect collection of facts that we have. I have a couple of other points, but I've been talking longer than I'd like, so let's turn this back. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if possible. There are some specific things that the Killer Angels gets right, and there are some specific things that it gets wrong. Factually about the battle. What are some of your favorite rights and wrongs about the battle? We'll start with that.
My favorite rights and wrongs. And he just stood there and blinked. That will be one. be the Trimble on Ewell statement. Some of the large things that stand out in the Killer Angels to me, when Michael Shaara wrote the book, the interesting thing about it was, for instance, the conversations between Lee and Longstreet when they're talking about whether they should do Pickett's charge or not. If you look at his text, and this goes back to what I said personally about me reading it and why I hesitate to read it because it will run together. He actually puts quotes from James Longstreet's articles or books, whichever ones he got them from, and intersperses those with fiction. Another example and answer to the question will be Robert E. Lee's conversation with Jeb Stuart upon his arrival back at Gettysburg. This is not recorded. Reportedly, there was only one sentence that somebody recorded. It was something like, well, Stuart said, "Look, General, with these fine wagons I have brought you." And Lee looked at him and said something like, "Well, General, you were here at last." And then they stepped inside his tent. And that's where Michael Shaara took off with the conversation. You know, on a broader sense, the thing with the Killer Angels as far as right and wrong, you know, I don't know if you can say it's right or wrong. This is all about his perception of the people, and he says that in the foreword. You know, it's his, in the end, it's his perception of these leading men in the Battle of Gettysburg, is that his portrayal of the characters, especially the three main characters, and this is my three main characters, to me, Longstreet, Lee, and Chamberlain are the three biggest characters within the book. He puts to me a strong Longstreet, kind of somebody at Longstreet with a crystal ball, if you would, you know, not other historians, if you will, such as, for instance, like Douglas Southall Freeman, who painted Longstreet as sulking. That is not the way that it comes across to me in the Killer Angels. He also puts forth a weaker Robert E. Lee, where I think, at least in my perception, it is two strong personalities going at each other as far as the actual historical what happened in 1863.
Matt, I agree with you pretty much on your conclusions. About Chamberlain, I think his portrayal of what he was doing on the 3rd of July as a kind of apologist for a lost cause, I think it certainly is not my interpretation as a novelist. Sure, entitled, but it's not the same as mine. To read more about Chamberlain and to revert a little bit back to what I was talking about yesterday, Chamberlain's capsulized version of what the Civil War was about was the realization of human worth. And that does not fit with his portrayal in here of Chamberlain's view of the overall picture. And I think, you know, while Kilrain is a fictionalized character, I think in some ways it may be a combination of what Shaara knew about two real characters. One, Ruel Thomas, who was Irish himself, and is a character in this book, but quite a minor one, was not unlike Kilrain. And also, I think, the character of Tozier, the color sergeant. Tozier was one of those people from the 2nd Maine, if you've read the book. You'd never know that from reading this book. And in fact was in the 1870 census a member of Chamberlain's household. These are the two guys that won the Medal of Honor on that I think his pacing up and down speech to the prisoners of the Second Maine is probably I think that part is overdrawn, and I don't think it happened like that. Certainly don't. And you know, if I would write my own fictionalized account, which it would have to be, since we don't really know what was said, it would be a little more soldierly and a little less sympathetic to those men. And as was pointed out in Pete's talk this morning, I mean, they were not alone in that division between 2-year enlistees and 3-year enlistees. It happened in a lot of regiments all across the North.
In that very speech, it seems that Shaara was correct in saying that soldiers fight for each other. But the way that's worded, it sounds very 1970s to me rather than 1863.
Me too.
Some of you perhaps are familiar with Scott Hartwig's book, A Killer Angel's Companion. That's extremely useful in getting the facts sorted out, right and wrong. I recommend that book if you're interested in pursuing this topic further. But we all have some pet peeves, I suppose, about the book and the movie. I have a problem with the portrayal of Robert E. Lee. He seems to be a little too doddering, too fuddle-headed and mild, whereas you know, his own staff is afraid of his temper. And as people said when he was appointed commander of that army, you know, his name might be Audacity. He will take more risks and take them quicker than any other man in the army. And so you have that audacious, tremendously forceful personality of Lee's, I think, underplayed in the book. One of the things that bothers me about now getting into the movie, we'll reserve some time for that if there's opportunity at the end of this. But even in the book, a lot of the discussion takes place around the campfires. And you have this great thing where Pickett, you know, says about Robert E. Lee, well, you know, you might be descended from an ape, and I might be descended from an ape, but General Lee is not descended from an ape, and that's great stuff. But really, were they sitting around campfires talking about this stuff? You know, General Meade got only a few hours of sleep in these 3 nights. He was busy. They were all busy. There was a war going on. There was a battle going on. I don't think they were roasting marshmallows and talking about, you know, whatever. So this is one thing, and that's a problem you have in art. You've got to have characters talking about things to tell the reader little elements of significance and meaning. And how are you going to do that? In between shots while they're loading, you know, so you have them doing it at campfires. That's an unrealistic element, I think, in there. Well,
but I would like to add that Robert E. Lee is not descended from an ape.
I think that's a
Well, I agree. There are only those 2 exceptions, Lee and Chamberlain.
I would like to ask the panelists something else. This book, it seems to me that Michael Shaara had been reading Glenn Tucker before writing Killer Angels. His book on Gettysburg, and also his book, Tucker's book, Lee and Longstreet at Gettysburg, which, as far as I know, is the place where you really get the rehabilitation of Longstreet at the expense of Lee. And because the Virginia clique had really put Longstreet in the doghouse and blamed him for the loss here. And then I think it was, at least in my reading, Tucker who rehabilitated him. And that's what occurs in The Killer Angels. And I wonder what both of you think about the Lee Longstreet controversy as presented in The Killer Angels.
Well, having read Tucker before I read any of this, I was beginning to develop some sympathy for Longstreet's position, having subsequently read a number of other things and been here and talked to so many knowledgeable people here and in other places. It's again what I said about the whole question, yes and no. I'm not really clear on just what that relation, what the detailed conversational relationship was likely to have been, and looking at it in the long picture, I think Lee was right. But that's been a developed position. At first, I went into even considering the matter as a Longstreet supporter.
Did anybody know the name of my child? Do you think that's a freak accident? Okay. What did the sign say on Harry Truman's desk? Buck stops here. And who does the buck stop with at the Battle of Gettysburg? Robert E. Lee. Okay? So we can get that out of the way. I would put Lee and Longstreet into the context of something that you can apply to most of y'all's everyday life is, those of you that are in a marriage or a relationship or something like that know that every relationship is not always smooth. You know, I always hear like my parents' generation talking about how my generation and those below don't know how to ride the ship through a storm, you know, so to speak. You believe in it? Having said that, I would put forward to you that Lee and Longstreet and all these subordinates on that level, Meade and his commanders, for the most part, Grant, Lee and his corps commanders, etc., they are actually together more than a marriage. They spend more time together. That is what, if you go back to John Reynolds' wounding, and when they find the locket of the young lady on his chest, they didn't know about that he was even dating anybody. That was a shock, because when you spend 24 hours, 7 days a week, you know somebody, or you think you know somebody. Now, going back to Lee and Longstreet, it is a shame that James Longstreet, who has had a solid record of combat record, leadership record, etc., for the majority of the war, what more can you ask? For a person, it takes a specific type of individual to be able to manipulate that many chess pieces on the board and to react to the fog of war and things that you don't expect. And James Longstreet obviously can do that. For better or worse, though, he is judged for his 2 days here at Gettysburg. That's the way it is. And like they were saying, the Lee partisans in the post-war years pinned that upon him. Longstreet did not help his cause, of course. We don't need to go directly that deeply into that. He becomes a Republican. He becomes a Catholic. And he takes a job from the United States government. All three of those would be considered heresy in the South. But going back to the marriage theme right here, the two men, I think, mutually respected and liked each other. If you read Fremantle, what does he say before the Battle of Gettysburg? In order to make General Longstreet happy, just mention General Lee. And he smiles. I'm paraphrasing that right there. But for whatever reason, just like the relationship, and this is my opinion, Gettysburg's got 1,000 opinions on it. The relationship is just not clicking here. It has gone sour. You can attribute that to a number of things, but the men are not communicating well during the Battle of Gettysburg. Once again, the buck stops with Robert E. Lee, but Longstreet, Hill, Ewell, Stewart, Lee is also not served well by his top subordinates.
Matthew mentioned that line of Trimble when you began, and he just blinked. Okay, so I'd like to ask both of you. General Ewell said later, he said that we lost the battle for a number of reasons, a number of mistakes were made, and I made most of them. And I wonder where both of you come down when it comes to Ewell and the first day, the decisions made there, and whether Stonewall Jackson would have done better.
I don't know, but I can tell you, some of you heard me at least briefly mention this yesterday. The Duke of Wellington, commenting on the Battle of Waterloo, said it was a day that needed a lot of saving, and it was a damn near thing. And you could certainly say that for the Battle of Gettysburg. You can say that about the loss of the battle and the victory of the battle. There were so many points, and one can make a really good fine case of this whole thing turning out differently had Ewell gone ahead. I don't know. I mean, and who knows what if history. We can only guess at that. I would have guessed Jackson would have probably gone on it, but who knows?
Well, I don't know what Stonewall Jackson, this is, a hypothetical question, but what would Stonewall Jackson do if he was here? I don't know what Stonewall Jackson would have done if he would have been at Gettysburg in July of 1860. Yep. But I can assure you of one thing. He would have stunk pretty bad. If you think about it, Robert E. Lee, what I can tell you is that Robert E. Lee is going to enter the Battle of Gettysburg with 2 brand new subordinates as a result of the death of Stonewall Jackson. And these subordinates, I would put forward to you that Robert E. Lee was a macro manager, right? Mm-hmm. Going back to Doc's question, take the hill. What does Robert E. Lee say to Richard S. Ewell? I want you to take that hill if practicable, right, but don't bring on a general engagement. How do you do that? But that is a discretionary order. Lee worked well with leaders who he could issue broad orders and allow them the details. What did they say about Robert E. Lee? He just sat up on the Seminary Ridge and received messages all day on July 2nd, rarely sending one or receiving one. That's his style of generalship. On the other hand, A.P. Hill and Richard S. Ewell are come to Robert E. Lee from under the supervision or leadership, command is the word, of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson likes a macro leader over him and loves to be a micro leader himself. Jackson will sit there and tell you, okay, Ewell, I want you to attack the hill on the evening of July 1st. I want you to use these brigades. I want you to post your artillery here. And if these aren't executed by 7 o'clock, I will have you shot at dawn. All right? Now, you picture yourself. As far as Hill and Ewell, you have to make an adjustment on the fly. You all know from your own work experience, whatever you do in life, when they bring in a new supervisor, there is a period of adjustment where everybody's figuring out what is going on here. What do they like? What are their quirks? What do they dislike? All that. And, obviously some supervisors are better than others. Robert E. Lee and his 2 new subordinates, Hill and Ewell, have to make an adjustment, but they cannot make the adjustment until they've had time to work together. And they haven't had any time. This is the first battle which they're under. And I just think that is where the South and Robert E. Lee and the command structure is really going to go. Stonewall Jackson, to answer the direct question, if he was going to do it, he would have had to reorganize that army very quickly, which was burdened with 5,000 federal prisoners on July 1st. They would have to attack through a town or try to get around the area. Also, the troops that would be at his disposal, if they were the same way they still had the same army organization. Robert E. Lee actually had one last division on the field that day, Richard H. Anderson. And Robert E. Lee personally tells Anderson to stand down. So if you take Anderson's division, which would have been in Longstreet's corps at the time, away from Jackson, what would he have had to attack? These are all the questions. We could just go on and on and on and on. But it's not that simple a thing, Casey.
Thank you. I asked the question because the book seems to have a point of view. You know, we have Trimble saying that, and he's not really answered. So you come away thinking, oh gosh, you know. An interesting book by Charles Royster called The Destructive War has a memorable statement on this. He says that what Lee needed at Gettysburg was not more Jackson, but less Jackson. That is, that there was too much of an instinctive aggressiveness, unconsidered aggressiveness in the Army, and that was not helpful. Remember that statement by some officer who said, just give us 1 hour of old Jack. It's my conviction that he was referring to Jack Daniels.
I've been there. They didn't need that.
I will say I am surprised to hear this coming from the religious department.
I'm
the Lord loves his spirits.
I'd just like to say one more thing in terms of characterizations in this book. I don't think he's got Arthur Fremantle right there. This man was an officer of the Coldstream Guards. I think he was not such a fop as he's portrayed to be in this book. And I think a terribly interesting book is his book, 3 Months in the Southern States. And it's a wonderfully descriptive book. And he happened to be at certain places at certain times in those 3 months that just marvelous. He was there for the New York draft riots, for example, and he was there when they brought, boy, I'm having a senior moment, to Copperhead over the line to the south. Van Landingham. Yeah, he was there to witness that too. And here's just, you know, while I'm digressing, but while I'm on the subject of Fremantle, he gets to San Antonio. He came into the country through Matamoros, Brownsville, and rode up to San Antonio, where he is greeted by the mayor, who shows him around the town, who shows him all the sights of San Antonio, and doesn't even mention the Alamo. I need to do more research on that. I want to know how come he didn't. I mean, that's a mystery to me. It doesn't even mention that Alamo at all. That's enough about Fremantle.
I'd like to get back to the question of understanding and what understanding is. The question that we're to deal with is, do we need the Killer Angels to understand the battle? And that assumes that generation after generation has an understanding of something. And let me answer yes to that question in this sense, and then perhaps you will agree or disagree. But you don't understand something that you don't know about. You don't understand something that you have forgotten. We probably wouldn't know about the Battle of Borodino if it weren't for War and Peace. We wouldn't know about the Trojan War if it wouldn't be for the Iliad. Now I say this because I teach literature and I've done so for decades, and I'm conditioned to think this way. But I think that's one of the values of a piece of literary art, is that we won't forget. And I think to us, the Battle of Gettysburg is a very nearby thing. We're not that many generations removed. But what about 500 years from now, say 1,000 years from now? Think of how long since the Trojan War. We need art to maintain the human memory of something. And I think that's another sense in which a great piece of literary art is necessary.
We absolutely need that. We know about the Trojan War, unless you're a student and an archaeologist and such things. We know about the Trojan War from a guy who sang about it 300 years later. Once more, dear friends, unto the breach. We know about Agincourt through somebody who wrote about it hundreds of years later, and that's what we know. A fictionalized, personalized version, and that is what makes the difference. People come alive through those versions, and that's why we need the killer angels and such.
I'd like to ask a question. Since we're here, and since your literature, how do you think it rates? Do you think it stands the test of time? The Killer Angels, do you think it's...
I'm afraid it's like asking what would Stonewall Jackson do now. Well, it's still too early. It's a compelling story, but I'd like to give it a couple hundred years, and we can all come back. 100 years from now, I can answer that. I mean, it's not the Scarlet Letter, but it's not just drugstore fiction either. I mean, it's a good piece of work. And that leads me to another aspect of understanding. Suppose we didn't have the Killer Angels, and what we're going to hand down to the next generations as an understanding of Gettysburg or the Civil War, because I think this is about the whole war, not just the battle. But if what we're going to hand down to future generations is going to be, let's say, not this, the field is going to be given to gods and generals. Or maybe the only thing that's really going to last, if we don't have this 300 years from now, is Gone with the Wind. It's a great story, a great movie.
Yeah, I like that movie.
Yeah, sure. It is one of my favorite movies, but I mean, Southerners are better at telling stories. You know?
Yeah, Yankees are better at burning stuff too.
We had a bottle of Jack Daniels up here and something. Or let me say, worst of all, suppose, and this, my son-in-law is in film studies, and he says you cannot overstate the importance in film history of Birth of a Nation. It transformed movies in America. And it was Woodrow Wilson's favorite movie, and if you've actually seen it, you wouldn't believe it in terms of how racial it is, how racist it is. It's just phenomenal. So that's another sense in which the Killer Angels is necessary, I think, because we can leave the understanding of an event like the Civil War to this piece of art or this story or that story. In other words, what narrative is going to be handed down? And we need to modify narratives continuously and not leave it to something that we think perhaps is really the wrong way to understand the Civil War, such as Birth of a Nation.
I think so too. I'm not in the field, so I can say it. I think it's a classic work, and I think it will live indefinitely. It brings to life characters that were here, that had personal experiences here that all of us can relate to, and that's the idea. That's the idea of literature generally. And in that regard, can it change people's lives? Yes. And, I mean, I'm an example. It changed mine. I went after Chamberlain like, a hungry dog. By the way, we had a fellow talk about Ambrose Bierce today. It just reminded me of this. His definition in Devil's Dictionary of a pygmy is a small hogmy. I love the definition. Go ahead. I digress again.
We got everything here, folks.
The Killer Angels is probably will stand the test of time. I would think. I wonder what the book's legacy would be without the movie.
Yeah.
The movie really jump-started the book. I personally had never heard of it. That thing took off like a rocket. The sales, and it's still selling today. I'm sure it's not at the same clip of the 90s, but the movie really did a lot for that. I don't know, going to a broad kind of a little bit different subject, but the same subject. Michael Shaara, does it take, in order to write a classic, I don't know if you could build the perfect writer. It's all about what the reader, what style he likes, and obviously the personal talents of the writer. But I've noticed, like Michael Shaara, he was an English professor. He was not a historian. He read 2 or 3 books. I didn't know that about Tucker. I'm curious about that. He read 1, 2, 3 books about the Battle of Gettysburg, and then wrote the novel. Do not write this down, my front row note takers. But my understanding, somebody told me, which I have never confirmed from any viable, reliable source, is actually Buster. Buster is the author, in part. In certain parts of the book, that's where he puts his thoughts into the role right there, into the pages. I don't know if that's true or not. I tried to get a hold of his son, but I guess he's traveling right now to ask him that. You look at the big historians of our day, such as, I'll pick somebody like World War II, like Stephen Ambrose, or general American history like David McCullough, 2 trained historians. But you look at the classics, Civil War authors of the previous generation, like Bruce Catton or Douglas Southall Freeman. They were both newspaper men.
Right.
And they come at that writing style, and I think that's what adds a lot to the novel. Also, is that Michael Shaara was not I'm not saying it would have been bad if he was a historian, but as an English professor, obviously his life's work was the study of words.
To that I say amen. That's the reason I'm prompted, moved to say that. In case we have not been theoretical enough, I would like to propose a little bit of theoretical thinking here. There's another reason for this book being necessary. What does art do for understanding something? And what I propose to you to think about is that understanding is art. Art selects, arranges, emphasizes, and so on. Another reason that understanding is an art, or is art, is that life does not make sense. Reality does not make sense. You don't have to ask contemporary physicists that. Ask any one of us who's had experiences, any one of us who remembers Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Does life make sense? Life does not make sense. To derive some kind of sense or understanding out of life is art. It creates something that's not there in itself. Or if it is, it isn't so to our minds, perhaps in the mind of God again. But it's something that's larger than our minds. The Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said to the National Press Club some years ago, he said, "The great questions in life do not have answers. which is another way of saying life doesn't make sense. You don't have answers. And if you're going to make sense of it, if you're going to try to understand, that in itself is an art. So there's more refined art, there's higher art, there's art that leads us into our own understanding. Or not. That's a rather extreme statement, and I'm sure not everybody agrees with it, but I'm proposing that as a point of view. We'd like to think that life makes sense, but maybe in some moments we realize that it doesn't. So in a sense, this is not removed from understanding in life. It's the essence of it.
I think you're absolutely right, Kent. And to that point, now I can't remember the name of the book, but I sure remember the author, John Didion's book that just won the Pulitzer Prize, about the death of her husband and her daughter in the same year. Said, and I think it's very illustrative of the point you're making, we survive by telling each other stories. And that is our individual artistic way of surviving, of making some sense of a random world that is otherwise difficult, impossible, difficult to understand.
I'd like to make a parallel to some contemporary art. Any fans of zombie movies here? I never went to one of these until yesterday. My son and I, some fellow who looks like me sitting over there, and I went to see World War Z yesterday. And this, I realize, connects to a whole generation, I mean decades of these movies. And most of us perhaps think of ourselves being too serious to see these things. Now, I've never understood the appeal of them, but I had to think about it yesterday. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's a reason people go see these things. There's a reason why this has struck some kind of deep chord. And it relates directly to why The Killer Angels is valuable. It's because, in the case of zombie movies, this is an image of humankind. Now, if The Killer Angels isn't that, then what is it? But think about it for a minute, zombie movies. For one thing, what you see in these movies is that our worst enemy is ourselves. We have relatively little to fear from some asteroid hitting us, relatively little to fear, relatively, that is, from nature. Our greatest enemy is ourselves. And these movies are an image of that. I suppose there's something satisfying also in watching, some characters mow down multitudes of human types, and you don't have to feel bad about it. That's perhaps one of its appeal. But I think there's a that more fundamental unconscious appeal that it's a picture of humankind whose worst enemy is us. And secondly, what better image of what's happening in this world than these zombies in these multitudes covering the face of the earth? What are we doing? What more destructive image can you find than humankind in the billions now, covering the face of the earth, paving it, polluting its surface, even reaching into the atmosphere, pumping enormous quantities of carbon into the atmosphere with our ships and planes and so on. And before we think about, oh yes, that's right, this is my neighbor who backs his Hummer out of the garage, and drives mindlessly like a zombie, never even thinking about what he's doing to the world. And everything that we do is the same way. This watch of mine, has a battery that's not good for the earth. And this pen here that I'm holding was manufactured. There's plastic in it and so on. We daily do all these things that consume and destroy. We are like this unstoppable horde, of whatever it is taking over the earth. And so in a sense, this book is a similar image of humankind that works at the unconscious level, that helps us to understand in a larger sense, to use Lincoln's phrase, to understand in a larger sense human life and human nature. Because we've got Chamberlain and Kilrain talking, and Chamberlain is thinking of Shakespeare, and he's thinking, what a work is man. He's how like an angel, and so on. Kilrain says if he's an angel, he's the killer angel. So why are people fighting the Battle of Gettysburg? Why is there civil war? And since all wars are civil wars, and we're fighting in Gettysburg for each other, we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting for all these reasons, but we're fighting because we're human and we fight. We kill because we're killers. And if we are angels, we are killer angels. Well, on that solemn note, I'll turn it over to concluding comments.
Wait a minute. What do you think about the movie?
You go first. I don't want to spoil it. They're out there.
Like it? Was it worse than
Yeah, it was captive. Every moment was.
Did you really sit there and analyze it like that?
I was too caught up in it. It was last night when I should have been thinking about this.
I was hoping you'd. You're right, and he is, and Kilrain is right. We're angels, we are killer angels. And it is an indictment, but it's not a lifetime indictment. We can all work on that imperfectly. I'm just going to say it. I have a friend who has straightened me out in terms of my own sense of perfection, which is, I have to say, looking at it in some realism, my illusion of control. He says any job worth doing is worth doing imperfectly. Think about that a little bit. We are imperfect. We are angels, but we're killer angels. But we have jobs to do. And one of our jobs is to not act upon those impulses of deadliness that are implied in that statement. I think, I hope that we all do that. If I have a hope for the world, it's the hope that we work at our own sense of commonality, however imperfectly we do it. It's important for us to do it. It is what I think makes us more human the more we do it. Chamberlain said, all I did is Chamberlain said that when we reach out and work together on our common interests, we reach the limits of the soul's ideal. We extend our own soul by intertwining with the souls of others. He's right about that, I think.
This is going to test me right here. I can't think of why I've never thought of zombies like that, first of all. And second of all, I've got to follow that, which is a great conclusion from Mr. Jim. So I got to ride on clouds. I don't see the world that way. And as far as the legacy of the killer angels, and which translates into the Civil War and so forth, there was an ancient. I would love for everybody to learn their inner nature and from their own foibles and so forth. But I don't believe we'll ever see the end of war. I hope, as far as we're concerned, that the legacy that comes out of the killer angels and the Civil War specifically what happened to begin the Civil War is we lost our ability to compromise. We lost our ability to talk. We lost our ability to get along civilly. I pray that whatever generations you came from, if you were the English or the Scots or the Irish or the African Americans who came here, etc., we all came here and we all homogenized and we became Americans. I hope that the future generations will bring that, and that when we know, I'm not telling you anything, when we become a minority, we being the majority of this crowd right here, that the new majority will still make sure that our rights are still intact. The saying that we have imperfectly tried to do theirs. The Civil War was fought a lot over rights right there. And I pray that we never have to fight over those rights again. And that this country, and I'm just self-centered right here, I'm only worried about America. I can't worry about everybody else. And perhaps I'm an isolationist, I don't know. But I hope that this country will be able to pull it back together again. And we will look to such people as Chamberlain and Lee and Longstreet and the other characters defined within the Killer Angels for examples of ways in which we could go forward. Thank you.
On these two splendid notes, we will conclude. Thank you very much.